So what when you talked about Standing Rock and the fact that you had thousands of people in one place just blocking a road, and then it required the police forces of, like, a giant area surrounding to, like, suck up all their police and put them all there. So basically what you're saying, the implications of that is, because there's zillions of people around who believe in stuff. So if we manage to get like thousands of people in 10 different places at once, right, who care about stuff, then you could successfully, despite the insane military and police power of the state and of the wealthy, we could still conceivably amass in certain ways that would render that force kind of useless. Does that make sense? Do you think?
I mean, that's exactly what I'm saying, and that reality shows its face in moments like that so
Mm-hmm.
clearly. One of the ways to relate this to like kind of a biological framework,
Mm-hmm.
like there's this insight. I think Conrad Lorenz is the first like behavioral scientist that I read talking about this. There's this reality that dominance hierarchies within a given species are typically not maintained by actual aggression, but
Mm.
mostly by aggressive displays,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's actually a sort of logical inevitability because if you go look at a chimpanzee group or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
it's not like the alpha chimpanzee could win a fight with every other chimp
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously, right?
Mm-hmm.
They'd destroy him.
Mm-hmm.
And so like that is also true of our species. Like
Mm-hmm.
the mostly we are controlled not by like it's not like we're actually fighting all the time. It's mostly by the implied threat or the explicit threat of violence. But that when these moments of uprising occur, it becomes really clear that they don't have the resources to actually physically coerce us, everybody that they're coercing through threat. Like they can't
Right.
actually jail us all or beat us all up
So
or
it's a
kill us
matter
all.
of getting enough people involved at the same time. Because really, even giant protests can get crushed easily. But if you have enough big protests in enough places at the same time, then you actually, never mind that there's a political cost to just like mowing down a bunch of protesters, which, even if you have one little protest, you can't just mow everybody down, but you can kettle them and arrest them and make their life miserable in a bunch of ways. But because when we think about, politics 100 years ago, and you had this revolution and that revolution, and, even though they went badly, you realize that, like, oh, the state was so much weaker back then. You could storm the Bastille, you could do this, you could do that. But now we just have this massive, ridiculous state that could just nuke us all to hell, and we can't even do anything. There's no point. But basically, not only is it not true because of the political cost of just mowing down a bunch of people in a democracy, but there's also just the structural, the power is not necessarily as strong as it seems to be in the face of enough people mobilizing in the right way. Does that make sense?
No, exactly. And I want to say, like, I think that summer of 2020
Mm.
was a time when I
Mm-hmm.
saw things get diffuse enough that those realities started to actually become really apparent. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, sure, there's the big march in Oakland,
Mm.
and then like the experience of that is going to be that it's not just the Oakland police, but it's also the police from all the it's police from all around there.
Mm-hmm.
It's police from, like the Walnut Creek, California police are there. And
Mm-hmm.
then you think, huh, wonder what it'd be like if some of us were raging in the streets in Walnut Creek right now. And then, but in summer of 2020, that actually kind of did happen. So
Mm-hmm.
there were
Mm-hmm.
like really significant concentrations of police that would descend on some like main phase of social unrest happening somewhere, but then there actually were
Hmm.
like factions who were all over the place where the police weren't, and it really did illustrate that reality. They truly do not have the capacity for physical coercion
Hmm.
for all of us at the same time. They
Right.
really don't.
So it's just interesting. So a movement like that was pretty spontaneous and didn't have any specific goals exactly, besides some like generalized stuff. So if you think if they had more specific demands, again, sort of comes back to Occupy Wall Street. A lot could have been achieved with that particular. Like if you have a repeat of that, like in another year or 2 years or whenever, but people have figured out like, oh, we need to press for A, B, C specific demands, that you could just get a lot of shit done. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean that level of momentum, yeah, definitely. If that was happening among I guess kind of like a more strategically oriented cadre that
Hmm.
had like, yeah, I mean, I think that the potential is really vast.
Hmm. Super interesting. You did some episodes on group mind and trauma. How do those play into all of this? Some really interesting the group mind stuff, like the dancing epidemics. There was a lot of, you talked about cults. You grew up in a cult. There's a lot of things to talk about in this these issues. Why? How do they weave into this whole project?
Yeah, I mean, so one really, well, maybe the most fundamental thing that I could say is that I think that any meaningful process of social transformation, anything that we'd describe as a revolution or anything like that, involves, like we say, people finding points of commonality, and it's basically like a process of people asking, like, who is in my group? Who do I stand with?
Mm.
Who do I share who do I have something in common with?
Mm.
And so much of human dynamics are about people perceiving themselves as part of one group and not a part of another, and there
Mm-hmm.
being a conflict between the two. And so some of what I'm getting at in the group psychology series is just the simple fact that there are powerful, evolved psychological mechanisms for group identity and group participation, that those are always going to be really salient features of like the human mind,
Mm.
but but what actually constitutes a group, like what
Mm-mm-mm.
defines a group, has no evolved psychological content whatsoever. And so, like, obviously, like, there are a bunch of ones that, like, there are a bunch of group identities that people see as really psychologically salient, that like create the conflicts and the dynamics that they currently do in our societies,
Mm-hmm.
but that I truly believe that we could replace a lot of the group identity criteria that people are currently employing
Mm-hmm.
with other group identity criteria, and that it would create a revolution. I really believe
So
that.
like, so you talked about some really interesting studies, and I'm going to be referring to this as well. But you mean like categories like race and stuff? Like you could transcend those sort of categories and make different categories that bring people together to achieve common goals, right? Like that's one of the reasons why I'm so into really focusing on what left and right mean, because there's a lot of people who think that they're on the right who actually share so many of the goals that are left-wing goals, and there are a lot of people that think that they're on the left that are actually little hierarchical dictators who belong on the other side, and we shouldn't be aligning with those. We need to know what those words mean before we form our coalitions. And politics is all about forming coalitions, right? Like if you're in a minority group, whether you're trans, whether you're black, you need to expand your coalition to win, right? To get there's winning hearts and minds, but to win hearts and minds, the best road to winning a heart and mind is self-interest. Is like self-interest. Like, oh, I have these same. I'm trans. I'm a small group, but I have these same self-interest. This affects you in this way, ABC. So you should actually see me as on your side, and I'm a valuable member of your coalition, and you're a valuable member of my coalition. Race is huge, gender, all that stuff. But sorry, yeah. So you talked about when you talked about in groups, and that there's no we have a deeply evolved mechanism for separating in group from out group, but there's no content to that mechanism. So you're saying that to discriminate is something that's very human, but to be specifically, let's say, racist or gender discrimination, like that's not specifically human. So talk about some of those studies and some of that research.
Yeah, I mean, the classic thing to cite in this line of discussion is the our minimal group paradigm experiments,
Okay.
and those are. I mean, it kind of almost seems, as I read through this literature, I got this very distinct impression that the scientists involved kind of liked coming up with the most absurd, meaningless markers of group identity that they could, because it really makes the point better or whatever. So
Like.
it's literally shit like, you know, like they divide groups up based on a coin toss, or like they give them like different colored headbands, or like, you know, I mean, like these findings have been replicated a number of times, and the delight, because you basically get the same result every time. The delight in reading the studies is just finding all the absurd things
So
that
what's the
scientists
result?
divided people up by.
So what happens when you give group A
But
purple headbands and group B green headbands? Like what's the result? What do you mean?
the results are profound. So behaviorally, like say the experiment involves people dividing up a real like cash incentive for participating in the experiment. People will actually favor their group over other groups,
The
even if
headband
the
group.
groups are the result of a coin toss or a colored headband. Or we can do this at the neurophysiological level. If we look at brain imaging studies, you know, like people who are in one group will feel more empathy at expressions of pain in their group than they will for people in the other group, even though these
Wow.
groups were invented in an experimental context like 10 minutes before.
Right.
You know, like, and this goes on and on and on, like at any level, looking at any, if you just like on a questionnaire basis, you know, like how much do you agree with people, like people or whatever, like they will rate people in their group better than people outside their group, you know. I mean, it just goes on and on.
And they haven't even
And
had
so,
group
yeah,
forming experiences. Like the green headband people didn't go through any trial of by fire
that's what I'm
together.
saying,
Nothing.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not even like you have to like put them in some situation where they like work together or like demonstrate some shared competence or anything like that. It's literally just assigning them to the group. It's like totally
Wow.
sufficient to generate all these really rich convergent differences in how people treat people. And so, you know, like I think
That's
I mean,
huge.
this kind of goes back to the question you were asking about like getting people to participate,
Mm.
and the barrier of like the awful person who just wants to point out how like terrible everybody is or
Hmm.
whatever. Like growing up in a cult and seeing how willing people were to submit to that horrible authoritarianism and to let terrible things happen to themselves and their children in order to belong to a group, right?
Mm.
Out of that motivation to belong to a group. And knowing how study after study shows like people's sense of isolation is so profound right now. Like
Hmm.
people more than anything need to belong to something, and this kind of like rapidly accelerating, like rapidly changing technological milieu that we inhabit, one of its big inadvertent consequences has been to like atomize people and to take them out of being like embedded in any group that feels meaningful and
Hmm.
feels like a foundation for an identity that, you know, they have an evolved psychological need to experience.
Hmm.
And I think that our mandate, like what we are trying to do in creating movements, and one of the reasons that I'm willing to fight a culture war against those people, you know,
Hmm.
so bitterly and fervently, is because like I think what we're really doing is giving people something to belong to. But that when people think about political participation, like when like person on the street thinks about it, literally their first thought is I don't want to get yelled at by, you know, like the
Hmm.
grad school dropout who has like the heavy academic framework, who's like, you monster, you oppressive monster,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so like I think it's our job to make people feel like if they were politically participating,
Hmm.
then they could make some friends, basically,
Yeah.
that they could be part of something that they know they desperately need in their lives, and that they can't really find a
It has
way
to be a fun
to
social
get, you
club
know. It has to
aspect
be
to it, right?
fun,
Because
yeah.
no one, why would anyone waste their spare time doing something if it's not fun? And so many of the activist movements, successful movements in the past, whether it's civil rights, women's suffrage, whatever it is, the labor struggles had so much to do with your local groups, whether it's your church group, your Bund Jewish group, your mosque group, you know, in the Arab world, your Elks, those weird social clubs that we don't have anymore, right? The Greek association, the Mypos old men association that you see now, all that stuff. Those were like because you'd be hanging out with your buddies and you're like, oh, there's a political issue we care about. Let's all go, buddies, because we don't have internet to waste our time. We don't have YouPorn to be jacking off to. Let's go do this, thing that we all care about, and we're talking about it. Like in every movement that you see that's successful, you have people getting together and talking about something and realizing that they have all these things in common, and that activates them through their social networks to go and do stuff. What do you yeah, and also just we were talking about the in-group out-group thing. It really makes me think of sports, right? You have like two opposing teams, which are just like the Bears versus the Cubs or whatever.
Yeah.
The Steelers versus, it's not even a thing, the Steelers, right? You just have these two teams, and everyone is just hooting and hollering and so ramped up that you have to crush the other team. But there's it's fun. Like sports is fun, but it's just based on nothing. It's just, they just invented an in-group and an out-group, and you got to crush the other team and you got to win. And it's like, so it's really, it makes us hopeful for defeating things like racism, right? And I think it explains a lot too, because like if you have a town where there's a large minority population, and because of history, especially black people, let's say, never got to amass any or amount of capital like the way white people have, because they came here as slaves, because then there was all this Jim Crow, and then once they finally had equal civil rights, and there was still a welfare state, and they were able to start climbing into the middle classes via unions and via industrial occupations, that's just when the big globalization happened, and the carpet got yanked out from under them, and so they just always ended up being a poor population. If you're a cop and you're going into a neighborhood, it's what's associated with crime is generally poverty, right? So when you are facing crime and danger, you are seeing brown faces, and that is going to help activate your racism, plus the stuff that you learned as a kid, plus the stuff that you hear on your right-wing radio crap. All that stuff is like making black and white the in-group, out-group. But if you go to Kentucky or West Virginia, or in Quebec, in Montreal, like in the east of Montreal, where there's not a lot of black and brown people, there's just poor white people, skid punks, different kinds of like, you will have different visual markers besides brown and white that you're going to divide people by, and the cop is going to go treat that skid white punk the same. And I see this. You treat the skid white punk with that same disdain, that same disgust. You're not going to call him the N-word. You're going to call him some other word, but it's the same mechanics, right? I think, as racism, but it's just based on some other in-group, out-group. I am normal, I'm middle class, I'm a mainstream person. You are a skid punk, you have tattoos on your face, you have a dog, you have earrings in your nose, like whatever it is, right? Or you're just some poor white trash person, you have a mullet, you're a chav, like in Britain, right? It's just activating the in-group, out-group. And if we understand that racism, I think maybe sexual minorities has maybe of a different psychological mechanism, but a lot of race stuff especially, obviously it's a little bit different, but it really melds in the same with class discrimination. It's very, very related, and it even comes, so like when Chris Rock is walking down the street and the police is racist against him and harasses him for no reason, well, he's kind of like a spillover from the class conflict that's existing, right? Between the poor class, which tends to be black and brown, which activates that racism, and then that goes and spills off against the rich black guy. What it's actually about those material conditions, because in West Virginia, that skid punk, there's no black person or no Latino person in that fucking town, but you have the same relationship between the police and those people. And, those are the people getting shot by the police, not the black person, because there is no black person, but it's that same class of people. Anyway, sorry, I just went off on a rant. What do you feel any that you have insights into the worst aspects of cancel culture type stuff? The worst vampire castle type people and the cults, because the cult like that you grew up in, because I see a lot of in those activist groups. There's definitely wanting to belong to a group. By having your own language, that gives you that kind of group cohesion as well. By having certain rules that everyone adheres to, that's all like group forming stuff. And then you often have in those groups, obviously I'm not shitting on every activist group, but you often get these like crazy vampire castle lunatic cult leaders who sort of take advantage of that stuff and start, exercising their power through those rules. You have a bunch of people who aren't psychologically prone to dominating other people and to controlling people, but then you have the person who is and who takes advantage of all that stuff. Do you see a relationship between that and cults?
Oh, totally. I mean, yeah, I would even like broaden it a little bit and just say that like cults, activist groups, whatever, but like it is actually just remarkable the extent to which human groups in general, which are constituted for very different purposes and have very different professed, like, not only like worldviews, but even like cosmologies, like just like in the most fundamental sense, like have very different stories about what's true and what they are, ultimately behave in very, very similar ways. Like very similar dynamics play out in human group settings very often. There's a fascinating book that Esri in the Emancipation Podcast Network sent me.
Swampside Chats,
Swampside Chats, yeah.
Yeah.
Called Bounded Choice, which was written by a woman who was in like a hyper dogmatic Marxist clique in I think like the 70s and 80s in the on the west coast of the United States. And she is comparing the parallels between her experience and the Heaven's Gate cult, which like kind of like ended around the same time that her involved that Marxist clique she was in. Like they had like a similar temporal history. Like they were both like offshoots of like 60s counterculture, right?
Yeah.
And they both like like kind of like lasted into the 90s, and awfully similar things happened in both settings, right? And I think in particular there is prevalent in activist groups and cults this thing that, I don't know, seems like it should be so innocent at the outset, or like kind of like intrinsically on its own terms doesn't sound like that bad of an idea, but for whatever reason is not something that humans do very well, which is like the process of critique, where we as a group, we're going to critique an individual who participates in the group to be a better participant in the group. And that doesn't, I don't know, that doesn't sound that insidious to me, but this is something that tends to almost never go very well. We like, for whatever reason, the human psychology is really not like equipped to handle these dynamics very well. And so that was like, the cult that I grew up in centrally featured this as a means of behavioral control, right? So that we would have these processes where literally like a couple hundred people were all telling one person what was wrong with them, how their behavior and their perceptions were insidious. And so like even as a child, I would have to like, get up in front of hundreds of people and have them all tell me what was wrong with me. And it was so disorienting and so psychologically, like disorganizing. And that mode of critique, when I have seen it play out in activist groups, I feel like it has felt incredibly similar. Like it just like feels the same way. And the effects on the critiqued individual are remarkably similar.
Which are?
Where, like there is a point where there's a point at which people just kind of give up and are totally willing to do almost anything to stop the critique. Wow. Like it is not something that people are not equipped to handle those kind of group critiques very well at all. And at a certain point, like absolute conformity ensues, is my observation.
I mean, that was a tool in a lot of communist countries as well, like almost that exact same type of process.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
I think Milan Kundera wrote a book about it, but it's just like, notorious stuff. Wow. I just want to rewind. I saw something in my notes just about how good ideas go from like ordinary people into the PMC class and it turns to garbage. When we talked about Christianity going from this sort of revolutionary group into this dominant group, that's the process. Like in between, in those 300 years, what happened is, I forget why, but there was at some point Christianity became very popular with the upper classes. At first with upper class women, and then somehow spread out, and then somehow it got to Constantine, and he realized like, oh, I could really use this shit, right? Like it just became this weapon. It went from being this really egalitarian, revolutionary, coming from the poorest, the rejects, the freaks of society, and then went up into the upper echelons and just got perverted into something else, which is why you see such totally different practices of Christianity, right? You have that weird, insane cult of wealth, or like Jesus with a machine gun mowing people down versus versus turn the other cheek, Jesus. Trauma, you have a few episodes on trauma. How does that play in to what we're talking about?
Pretty deeply, and on a bunch of different levels. Like, I think maybe the place to start is just, I believe that our social structure is pretty inherently traumatic, and I believe that one can invoke many forms of evidence for this, but the easiest one is just that rates of substance use and abuse and psychiatric disorders are rapidly increasing, right? And so I'm actually doing more episodes about this. Like, I spent the beginning of the day reading papers about like the correlation coefficients that exist for different psychiatric diagnoses with scores on the adverse childhood experience scale, which is just like a measure of how terrible your childhood was, and the correlations are very strong.
Like what? What's an example?
So disorders that we normally, that I think a lot of us have this amorphous, like the way that psychiatry presents these are just like misconfigurations of our brain that we're born with,
right? And
they never want to specify what's actually wrong with our brain. Like, psychiatry is actually militantly opposed to looking at the brain
structure.
Like in 2020, the APA actually wrote a position paper that brain imaging should never be used to validate diagnoses of psychiatric conditions.
Why?
I'm not joking.
Wow.
Because, and this is why, because brain imaging studies don't match their diagnostic categories very well, because their diagnostic categories aren't valid. But instead of saying, looks like our diagnostic categories aren't that great, they're just saying, don't look at the brain. And so, I'm covering that in the next episode, but it's like their contention is that we're born. They're like, we don't want to specify what is wrong with your brain.
You're all just garbage. You're born to fucked up.
You were born fucked. Like there's some misconfiguration of your serotonin or something.
Yeah.
And so you're just crazy. But so even like the disorders like schizophrenia, ADHD, and major depression that we don't typically associate with trauma have incredibly strong correlations with traumatic experience. There's also tons of overlap between all of these diagnostic categories. Like, so having one is highly predictive of having another.
Right.
And then if you ignore what the APA says and you actually do just look at patterns of brain activity and try to relate them to different disorders, what you'll find is that people who are in one diagnostic category often have very different patterns of brain activity, and that but also that similar patterns of brain activity transcend diagnostic categories. So it's like their schema is very incorrect.
It's a bit
very incoherent.
It reminds me of a borderline personality disorder. Like, I know a lot of women who are in some kind of borderline personality disorder therapy, because that is a thing that will get you public funding to get free therapy in Canada or Quebec at least. But it's so clear, and they know they don't have BPD, and it's so obvious that they don't fit into that category. But they're just like, you're a woman, you yell sometimes, okay, you got BPD. Oh, you tried to commit suicide once, you got BPD. Oh, you have trouble with relationships, you got BPD. It's like hysteria. It's like some weird category that clearly it matches a certain group of people that you can see, okay, that category makes sense for this narrow group of people, but then it's now just been spread out into all these other people because it has some functional purpose, which is just get people therapy or whatever. But what's fascinating to me though is how psychology is so disconnected. It's also the difference between left and right wing thinking, because left wing thinking, you're always trying to look at the structure. Where does this come from? Why is this happening, right? Why are people getting depressed? Whereas the right-wing thing to do is like, you're depressed because you're stupid and your brain is broken, or you're just a wuss or whatever it is. It's always just you, and there's no external reason. It's just you're dumb, your brain isn't working, and you need some pills, right? Anyways, this is just obvious stuff, but it's very interesting how that discipline has gone in that direction, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then like it finds itself, I mean like it all exists on a continuum. So like I was locked up in the psych ward for the first time when I was 17 years old,
Mm.
and over the course of those next couple of years was dragged to the psych ward by the police like, I don't know, you know, 6, 7, 8 times, probably cumulatively spent like 6 months
Mm-hmm.
locked up. And I have been diagnosed with, if you are a layperson, I have been diagnosed with every psychiatric disorder you have ever heard of. And the entire time, you know, it after like literally 5 minutes of discussion with a psychiatrist, right?
Yeah.
And given medication for all of it. And every time I'd be like, hey, look, I grew up under some really appalling
Mm-hmm.
circumstances, and like, yes, I am a little bit crazy
Yeah.
for sure, but I'm just trying to walk off what happened to me, you
Right.
know?
Let's
And
look at
they'd
the
be like,
connection.
no, that's definitely not it. It's
Ah,
definitely some horrible misconfiguration of your brain that you
right.
were born with. Here's some weird shit that'll make you stare at the wall all day and make your tongue swell up or whatever. And you know, but those people with their paradigm are are like having to face this challenge that the things they're claiming that we're born with are happening more and more often
Mm-hmm.
to more and more
Right.
people, right? And so
Makes
like
no sense.
my claim is that everybody exists like on a continuum with me, and maybe they didn't grow up getting abused in a religious cult, and maybe they're not getting dragged by the police to the psych ward,
Mm.
but that people everywhere are really, really suffering some very profound psychological distress.
Absolutely.
And you know, we can like measure this in all kinds of different ways, and that comes out of our social structure, and that one of the core sort of like precepts of the revolution that I would like to achieve
Mm-hmm.
is to convince people who are suffering in all these different ways, like, you know, whether they're taking heroin or whether they're just kind of like disassociating in their beds to sitcoms,
Mm-hmm.
right? You
Mm-hmm.
know, is like to convince them that what they're experiencing is not entirely their fault,
Mm-hmm.
and that the thing to do about it is to change the society that they
Yes.
live in, you know? I think that that also ties back into the like one of the biggest things that people are suffering psychological distress from is loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, again, it's this whole thing where we need to create uh, movements that are also participatory social structures that meet basic needs
Mm-hmm.
for connection.
I mean, you can see there's. I just saw something on this yesterday. Just how the numbers of depression just doubled and even 150% up on teenage girls just since 2010, right? And it matches like
Yeah.
when social media came up. You know, there's
Yeah,
you can't
exactly.
plus all the stuff we're talking about in bowling alone, like the amount of friends that people have today versus 10 years ago versus 20 years ago, the amount of interactions
Yeah.
that people have. You know, my friend's son is 14, he's depressed, but he literally is just on his on his cell phone or his computer all day, and he doesn't even see his friends except by cell phone, except by computer. There's no exercise. It's just like such obvious things. Or I look at my life, and I was a psychological wreck for many, many years, and you could, the catatonic, some like look like something's wrong. Circumstances change a little bit of time, everything changed. You go from being a complete miserable wreck who can't tolerate the slightest things because everything throws you into depression or into a rage, and then things change and you're just like, oh, I'm just like a really happy person, and it took these are the ingredients, right? This is what it takes to live a happy life. And you look around you and you see, oh, 90% of people just don't have these
Don't
ingredients.
have it.
It's not
Yeah.
that fucking complicated, right? Like, and that's what, you look at some of those hunter-gatherer societies and they have all kinds of problems, but what they don't have is anorexia. They don't have depression. They don't have, like, a lot of these illnesses that we think are just, oh, you need medication because your brain is broken. Well, how come there's people all over the world who don't have any of those illnesses, even though they have all kinds of adversity and all kinds of other problems that we share? But these specific problems are specific to our specific conditions. What are your hopes, sort of, for the future of humanity? Or maybe before that, where do you want to take this podcast project? Because I feel like your days of activism are not finished. It's like you're on some kind of break and you're doing something, but I feel like it's a step towards doing something else, in the future. What are Where do you see yourself going with this?
Where I want to take this podcast, so like you just mentioned, the book Bowling Alone,
Mm-hmm.
which describes like the decline in the sort of the institutions that political organizing used to like use as a substrate.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be like if you were organizing, you went to a church or a grange or a community group or
Mm-hmm.
wherever, but you found an existing, you didn't try to just like aggregate people, you found aggregations of people.
You were somewhere
found
already.
People,
You already
yeah,
had a social
exactly.
network that existed before anything got
Exactly.
activated to politics. Yeah.
Yeah, and you found people who had like a potent influence in those groups, and you got them to, like, and that's how the whole thing worked.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those kinds of like broad-based sort of like civic entities are in rapid decline. That's not like you can't really like find people that way anymore.
Mm-hmm. And that book is from 2001 or something, right? Like it's so much worse since then.
The trends have gotten so much more intense.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, totally. But so like the question then becomes like how, like just literally how to organize people, like where to find people, like what is the basis, and I think that the answer that keeps like really clearly presenting itself is like people are organizing more and more according to like niche identities on the internet and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that. There's just like way more, and so like I think that one of the things that I'm really trying to do is create a coherent sort of like science or body of theory for like for just actually gathering people, for organizing people by finding ways to communicate with them in the sort of like niche realms that they've self-selected to
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
different like in the digital landscape. But to do that really does require understanding the the like psychological predispositions that put one person on like watching diaper porn on 8chan and another person discussing like minimal drone music,
Uh-huh,
wherever
uh-huh.
that happens, and another person like is like you really have to like try to actually understand those people and where they're coming from, and then try to like craft. So I guess like that's my hope for the podcast, is that it evolves, obviously in collaboration with lots of other people who are doing lots of other great work, but it evolves into something that can provide kind of a foundation for
Mm-hmm.
understanding how to communicate with all the different lost tribes on all their different little corners of the internet, and
Mm.
bring people together into some sort of cohesive sense
So
of
it's like,
of group identity.
so instead of the Elk Lodge, which no longer exists, and the Knights of Columbia, or what, I forget, maybe that's a Nazi racist organization, but those different Knights of Labor and all those different organizations that we used to be part of, and that our parents or grandparents, or more like our grandparents, were part of, we have these weird internet, tribes and social networks. So
Yeah.
you think that, okay, let's turn that into the locus for some kind of organizing. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. However imperfect it may be, I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the only way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it is one of the things about today that's, if you look at any successful political movement, it always grows out of a social network, and it often comes at a time when a social network rapidly expands, or a social network is created that didn't exist before. Like during World War II, all the women went from the home to the workplace and got to know each other and speak to each other, and then formed all these social networks that they didn't have when they were at home, and that activated, and then even though when they went back home, the material conditions hadn't changed, in the sense that society was still as it was, technology was still more or less in the same place as it was, but women had just gone out, met each other, made friends, realized that they have common interests, and then came home and then pushed successfully for their interest. World War I, the right to vote. World War II was more Black Americans. That sort of triggered off the civil rights movement. So in our and there's no, and in our time, the internet is just one of those tools that should be, if you look back at history, one of those moments where, oh, now everyone can connect via the internet, there should be giant, big, huge, successful movements all over the place. But somehow it's like turned into this weird tool of like loneliness and isolation. But at the same time, it has that potential for social connectedness in ways that were just unheard of before. It's so much easier to organize something if you can connect in real time to all your people, right? Like think about like, in the Haitian Revolution, the reason that was successful is because there was this whole network of nighttime dancing that the slaves used to do. The masters didn't control what they did after work, so they would go and then form these like ritual associations and these dances that would go across the entire island, and that formed a communication network by which they could plan and pass on information. And there was no telephone, there was no anything, right? But today they managed to change their society. Of course, it didn't work out well, but whatever. So that's another story. We have such easy communication. It's kind of like, it seems like it's just a matter of time before we realize how to use it in a healthy, constructive way, I hope. Anyways, maybe podcasts like this are hopefully some early manifestation of that. I can see the discourse, the types of things that people are saying, the analyses that people are having today are much sharper than they were 20 years ago. Like I think we talked about this when I was talking to you on your podcast. Like 20 years ago, you had Noam Chomsky, and he was like your sharp mind, and he was running around saying all this stuff, and you had some other people here and there, but now you have like every bozo. You got all these podcasts with all these bozos basically, but who are sharp geniuses of political theory, and you have people. The quality of analysis that people have is much higher, and I think that has everything to do with the amount of available information. And there's got to be ways to connect to all the people who aren't necessarily interested in that stuff because they're not lunatics like we are, who are obsessed with politics, but who care about the same things that we care about, who have the same needs that we have, and that we can communicate with them in ways that reach them and makes them want to, join together and have a good time and change things at the same time. What does your ideal world look like? Like, do you have a name for do you have a political philosophy that has a name? There's this whole thing, like, do we still need these names for political philosophies from 100 years ago? Do we need new names? Do you fit in any of these boxes? And whether or not you do have a box that you fit in, what does it look like to you? The way things should be. Do you have any idea of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have like a box that I'm particularly fervent about. I think that in some sense, I mean, if we're really and truly just talking about the like the biggest picture possible,
Mm-hmm.
I am like what I really serve, what I feel the most sort of like the most like loyal, like the idea I feel the most loyalty to or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
is just that, there's this amazing reality that 4 billion years ago our planet formed, 14 billion years ago our universe formed, 4 billion years ago our planet formed, and that subsequently there have been a number of statistically incredibly improbable processes highly embedded in this whole massive web of like mind-blowing contingencies that has produced ever more complex configurations with ever greater awareness, right? Like like brains have been growing, the world has been getting more complex and more aware of itself, and ultimately what I'm clear on, whatever particular form society takes, is that I want that path to continue. That I want our tendencies towards greater and greater interconnection, complexity, greater and greater scale, and greater sentience to continue. And that is what I am the most willing to die for in this life, right?
Yeah.
And what that actually means could be so many things. It could be, but it requires that we constitute our lives around maximizing our potential instead of, on like blindly ignorant destructive tendencies and like petty acquisitiveness and all the other things that currently totally govern our world. What does it look like? I know that I want to I know that I want to shut down fossil fuel infrastructure
Mm,
and that I want to take carbon dioxide out of the sky.
mm,
I think that a world that I would like to live in has decision-making structures that are very bottom up, has like
mm,
locally constituted assemblies all over the place, that everybody has some sort of involvement in some group that
mm-hmm,
meets and sends a representative to a bigger group that
mm-hmm,
also meets, that sends a representative to,
mm-hmm,
that sort of like basic structure that pervades, I guess, more like anarchistic kind of
yeah,
thinking. But it is also actually true that I would like to see a world in which there are also decision-making bodies of experts
mm,
who interact with those like bottom-up assemblies, who are
mm-hmm,
just people who've specialized in fields. Like I think that one of the ways in which the political structure of a place like Canada or the United States, like one of the ways in which it's hopelessly archaic
mm,
is that all of these like technology has facilitated the emergence of all of these questions and issues that require some degree of specialization,
mm-hmm,
but political decision-making structures are exactly as they were before any of that was true.
right,
So we have like I've worked on climate policy for so long here in the US, but ultimately if I made any effort, like if I actually ever won and made any kind of significant policy gain, there are 9 people who would come out in ritual robes and consult parchment with calligraphy on it, literally, right? You know,
what?
like the Supreme Court,
Oh, okay.
and they would,
I was like, what?
and they
What are we talking about? Yeah,
but
okay.
literally, like these
Yeah,
people in these frilly robes
yeah,
would be like, well, the sacred calligraphy says that you can't make climate policy, and and
mm,
they those 9 people literally don't know anything about climate. Like
mm-hmm,
they're not like the
yeah,
kinds of people who you want making those decisions, right?
absolutely,
And neither necessarily is like my neighbors. Like my
right.
neighbors also don't necessarily know about that stuff. And so like I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I would like to see a world in which bottom-up collective decision making could actually coherently interact with like specialized understandings, like with deliberative processes that require some degree of like technical knowledge or
Well,
whatever.
isn't
Because I don't
yeah.
think we can navigate technological change without some degree of that.
Isn't that ultimately about there being public intellectuals or public experts who are out there articulating things for the rest of us so that we can make ideas and we can form rational opinions on stuff? Like if you're interested in this policy and then you'll get someone to explain it to you and then you can, because ultimately democracy, you want to have a say on it. Like the problem with democracy as it's constituted is people are making decisions based on things they know zero about and they've never read anything about, or they read something stupid about. So are you just talking about a world where people are just getting better information from people, or that they just don't have the decision making power and it's just people who know stuff are the ones making the decisions?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think that you're right. I think that that's ultimately kind of like one of my big picture objectives is like what I would just describe as the popularization of scientific reasoning.
Right.
And I think that that actually exists in very like militant opposition to the liberal narrative that's so prominent. It's like you can read a million pieces in like The Atlantic or
Mm-hmm.
whatever where these liberals are like, oh no, it's an epistemological crisis. People have decided to not trust experts,
Right.
and now they believe all kinds of crazy shit.
Yeah.
How do we get them to trust the experts again?
Right.
And I'm like, fuck you, right? Like that's just straight up authoritarianism. Like believe the experts and do what they say
Yeah.
is not, and people distrust people who claim expertise for very good reason.
Because they.
Like I just
Right.
described my experience with psychiatry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like those people are the experts,
Mm-hmm.
and what they did to me was monstrous,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like
Or Tuskegee
I
experiments. Like there's so many things. There's so many examples of. Yeah.
there's so many things, and so people are choosing to distrust like institutional like experts or whatever, and they're kind of like veering off into there's a profusion of mythologies that's occurring in our culture right now,
Straight up
and
dumb and
but
dumb ideas. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But like I really want to fight back against the notion that science is some highly specialized thing that only some people should be doing,
Mm-hmm.
and that whatever they decide is true, everybody else should just kind of submit to.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to popularize the notion that at its core, science is just about a basic reasoning process
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and a basic cultural framework that allows us, when anybody says this is true,
Mm-hmm.
to say, is it really?
Let's look into it. Like, yeah, it's the tools that you need to understand whether that's true or whether that statement is correct or not. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd like to popularize the notion that you actually can't reject science, that
Mm-hmm.
anybody who is making any kind of argument where they say, like where they're using any kind of the basic reasoning process that are just like literally essential to like the human cognitive apparatus
Mm-hmm.
is using some
Scientific
version
reasoning.
of what science is.
Yeah. Right. Excellent. Okay. Is there anything else you want to talk about that we missed that you feel like giving some information about or opinion?
No, I guess I'd just say the thing that I'm trying to do with my project is like, I have very much been making podcasts for other people who share some kind of political identity or some set of like assumptions or experiences. And so I think that if anybody who's listening is like familiar with my work and thinks they have a grasp on it, like my hope is that at some point I enter a phase where I'm communicating like we've been talking about
Mm-hmm.
with all kinds of people. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that is
Mm-hmm.
just kind of like generally the work that, I mean, I very much think that's also like what your podcast
Mm-hmm.
is getting at. I think that's like generally the work that a bunch of us have to do. I think it's a really interesting project, and so even if your listeners heard this and disagreed with some or a lot or all of what I was saying, like, like I'd invite them to accept that challenge, that like I feel like what we have to do as a species is figure out how to talk with people who
Mm-hmm.
perceive things differently.
100%.
And so I'd invite people who disagree with me to figure out how to do that with me.
Do you find that, because we both I think have this issue, is that we don't have this because we're not part of some specific niche, right? We're not like, oh, I'm an insurrectionist anarchist, or I'm ecological anarchist, or I'm a Marxist Leninist, or I'm a Maoist. Like, we don't have that ready-made niche of people who are just ready to glom on to, especially of like young people who are just like, oh, that's my identity. Now I'm gonna be an amazing fan of this, and I'm gonna love everything they do because they reaffirm my political identity. We're talking about like generalized stuff that can appeal to more people, but that doesn't specifically press anybody's serotonin receptors like, oh yeah, you're awesome, your group's awesome, our group is great, the other groups suck. Do you find that that's a challenge a bit in what you're doing, or no?
It's a challenge purely in terms of just gaining like a widespread audience.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
it would be much easier if I could just go on like every anarchist podcast or every Marxist podcast, mm-hmm. or like, yeah, but I can't, because what I'm doing is actually too idiosyncratic.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's honestly been amazing to get, like responses from people who
mm-hmm.
are coming from such different like backgrounds and just sort of like realms, and to see the ways in which, even though I'm not crafting what I consider at all to be like general audience messages, or I'm not even sure
mm-hmm.
there's such a thing anymore, but I'm crafting communication for people who I'm like, you must share some experience or background or like
yeah.
set of like beliefs, but at the same time, like the people who get in touch with me are from all over the place, culturally, politically, economic. Like, it's really interesting, and it makes me feel like there's actually I just feel like there's a lot of power there. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. And so I'd rather have 300 really different people listen to my podcast
mm-hmm.
within the first couple days than 3,000 people who all identify as like Earth Firsters,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really powerful. So you get a lot of engagement on a deep level from people who write to you?
I feel like I do. I mean, it's clear to me that there's some people who have been kind of wanting something roughly, generally, like what I'm doing for a long time. I hear a lot of people who just feel like I said, like I do feel like I just kind of violated a bunch of taboos, and there's a lot of people who feel really grateful that somebody is willing to do that. And there's a lot of people who write to me who have backgrounds in academia who are really grateful that I'm challenging some of those academic constructs that are really prevalent in our culture in the way that I am. So it's worth it. You know, it just takes longer to get a lot of people involved, but I think it's worth it to like just truly do your own thing.
Build a solid foundation. Yeah. Do you get like weird attack? Like I found, there was a point I was getting a lot of libertarians mad at me, then I was getting a lot of Marxists mad at me, then I was getting a lot of anarchists mad at me. Do you get that? Do you get people like mad at you?
I literally, so my like promotion strategy was like, oh, I'll just make some like leftists really mad, and then they'll talk about how evil I am, and that'll draw people to it, you know. And I was like you do that. I mean, I'll teach media workshops to groups where I'll be like, just do something, like write a press release that gets the right wing to react, and that's how you become serious and get taken seriously and get reach, you know. And I was basically doing that. I was like, I'm just doing that, but I'm just going to anger leftists. And it hasn't happened once. I have literally not gotten a single communication from somebody. Yeah, no, totally. I was like, I'm making myself a pariah. And I haven't gotten any real pushback at all. I don't know. It'll come sooner or later, I guess, or maybe I'm just gonna win. I don't know.
Probably haven't reached maybe an academic audience, because the stuff that you're talking about, it's very accessible to normal people, like who are interested in those sorts of things, and no one's gonna be offended by that stuff unless you've been through some kind of academic elite experience. And I guess those people haven't gotten around. Like, you're not popular enough yet that those people have heard at you that they can get mad about you or something.
Yeah, I need to interview somebody who's actually in academia, which I'm trying to do. I'm trying to cast that net, because then I feel like I want to force people in various disciplines to respond to some of what I'm saying.
Maybe well, it's too bad David Graeber is dead, but you had Catherine Liu. Do you know her?
No.
She writes a lot of anti-PMC stuff. It's weird because she definitely has absorbed a lot of that sort of language, but she hates academia. You can see the passion that she hates it with, and it's personal. It's kind of fun in that way. I'm sure. I don't know, if you reach out to her, maybe you get something interesting going on there.
Yeah.
Okay. If there's anything else, let me know. Speak now.
I think that's it.
Or forever hold your peace until next time, at least. And
until next time.
It's been a great talk. I'm looking forward to talking to you again in the future, and hopefully working on some projects, and looking forward to what you come up with next. And I hope that my audience is really into what you're doing, and that you check out the Fight Like an Animal podcast on all podcast delivery apparatuses near you. And you learn something. Look, what I like too is that you have, every episode has like a beautiful bibliography. You kind of like put me to shame. I feel like, oh fuck, man, I only pulled out 2 or 3 books for this one, and I'm doing a lot of stuff from memory. A lot of the stuff I talk about is stuff I read years ago, and I can't even find, where did I read that? I don't know.
I know.
And you're just like cranking out like, oh fuck, this dude just really read these 20 articles recently, and he's like quoting them and citing them, and there's beautiful bibliographies of and I kind of hate sometimes listening to your podcast. It's like, oh no, now I gotta read this, oh fuck, I gotta read that, I gotta read this, and then I'm like, getting all these articles, and I'm like, oh god, when am I gonna read all this stuff? But you have to, because it's so interesting, it's so relevant. So yeah, anyhow, all right, everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and until next time, see ya.